When it comes time to create UV mapping for what will become static mesh actors in Unreal, it should probably be considered a best practice for us to try and save as much time as possible when working through the process. Now, one way in which we can do this is by breaking a model into its separate components whilst we create the UV mapping for it. This will then mean that any objects we have that really share the same poly count and vertex numbers, well, we can reuse the mapping that we create for just one of them. For instance, we only need to create mapping for one of the arm supports that we have on our model here, and then we can copy that same mapping to the other support objects before combining the mesh back together again. We will need to make sure that the UV clusters are not stacked on top of each other in our light map UVs, but simply repacking the clusters to avoid this is much faster than redoing the unwrap itself. With one of the supports selected then, let's add a UVW map modifier using the quick access buttons that we have enabled, after which we can focus in on the support. Looking in the parameters rollout in the Modify tab, we come first of all to a list of preset projection types that essentially tell 3ds Max how we want our mapping coordinates to be applied, many of which are available whenever we auto-generate UVW coordinates upon a primitive's creation. We have the ability to resize our UVW gizmo by means of the length, width and height spinners. Now obviously, as we are currently projecting in planar mode here, we only have two of these parameters available, as the height or depth parameter, as we may prefer to think of it, has no associated information on a 2D shape such as a plane. If I switch over to box mapping though, you can see that we do indeed have the ability to control that parameter as well. We can also tile our texture interactively if we like on the UVW map modifier itself. However, as we will be taking this mesh into a game engine, the tiling is best left at its default of 1, given that any tiling of a material should ideally be done inside the engine itself, or in the original texture map if needed. When we create a sphere primitive in 3ds Max with the auto-generate feature turned on, we are simply applying the spherical mapping option that we see here to the newly created object. When we create a box, we are using box mapping, and so on. With these, as you can see, giving fairly decent results so long as we don't get too close to the geometry or have the ability to scrutinize the texture for too long. Having this simple set of options available though means that should we be mapping objects such as doors, tables, floors, walls or ceilings, we can get a good head start just by using these simple projection mapping types, thus allowing us to quickly apply UV mapping to key architectural static mesh actors, after which we can set about manually adjusting them so as to get the best out of both the textures and light maps applied. Three options that may be a little less obvious to us here though would be the shrink wrap, face and XYZ to UVW controls. Well, shrink wrap actually uses a variation of spherical mapping, one that truncates the corners of a map and then joins them all together at a single pole, much like an old drawstring money pouch for example. Now this option can be extremely useful whenever we need to quickly hide a mapping seam that would otherwise be visible on a single point of the static mesh. Face, as the name suggests, applies a copy of the applied map to every face on our object, making it a mapping type that isn't commonly used on game-ready assets, or for architectural visualizations for that matter, as it creates a UV seam for every polygon on the geometry, thus skyrocketing the vertex count once we get to take it into Unreal. And for similar reasons, XYZ to UVW is another mapping type that we probably won't use, as we will most likely want to work with bitmap images and not procedural maps, which is what this particular mapping type has been designed for, as it converts world or object space XYZ coordinates and turns them into UVW equivalents that can be locked to the surface of even a deforming piece of geometry. Helpful, as we say, for procedural textures in 3ds Max, but then not so helpful when it comes to creating good usable UV mapping for our static mesh actors in Unreal. Knowing what tools are available for a quick and dirty first pass at UV mapping, and knowing which ones we might want to avoid, means that we can very quickly get up and running when creating texture and light map UVs for our visualization models.